I don't know how I can be spending my time at my piano when there is so much pain in the world.
So with a world that's literally on fire, isn't focusing on art kind of pointless? And isn't it feeling a bit like a luxury that we can't afford when there's so much real work to do? It's a feeling that I personally definitely recognize, and yeah, recently I figured out I'm not alone in that. I remember going into a creative meeting a while back with the team when the old news about the US wanting to take Greenland, whatever it cost, came back up again. And yeah, the whole room kind of went quiet there. We were like half joking, half defeated, saying like, okay, let's just go plant some more trees and, share some things about art and saving the planet. And we were a bit like, yeah, what's the point of this actually? But that made me think, what if making and connecting with art isn't an escape from our responsibilities at all, but more like a vital tool of actually facing the problems? As creative coach Amy McNee says, when the world is literally and figuratively on fire, that is precisely when we need to make art.
What I need all of us to realize today is that we need to be at the piano making our art more than ever as we navigate these incredibly difficult things. Art is not just for kids. Art is not just for adults. Art is not just for peacetime. Art is now. We need it now.
And that made me realize that it's not a naive idea, but a necessary one to fight the numbness and actually spark some change. Why? Well, it's easy to feel like you're drowning in data, right? It's climate change statistics, economic forecasts that aren't that positive, or daily alerts and notifications about all the shit going down in the world. And in the meantime, we're just scrolling through an endless feed of crises or brain rot things to just turn our heads away from it. And after a while, I figured that something strange happens there. We kind of go numb. The numbers get bigger and the headlines get louder, but they stop hitting us with the same force like before. It's pretty much a survival tactic, right? Like our brains build a wall to cope with the information that's just too overwhelming for us to handle. Don't get me wrong, the reports and policy papers are essential, but they often fail to connect with us emotionally because they talk to our brains, but they forget to speak to our hearts. Now, I think Norwegian musician Aurora describes this disconnect perfectly.
Like it's like with statistics and numbers, and people don't understand these things. They don't emotionally connect to the way politicians talk about the environment, and that bothers me a lot. And music can talk, and art can talk, and movies can talk about it in a way that hits our hearts. And it has to hit the heart first. We have to genuinely care before we find it in ourselves that we want to fight. And so I think that's the biggest job for art, is to hit the heart.
As you can hear, she also noticed how people struggle to connect emotionally with the way politicians and news reports talk about the environment. There is a sea of information, but it doesn't inspire a real sense of urgency or care. And she believes that it can, in fact, feel so distressing and depressing that it leads to inaction instead of action. And that's why I think that the numbness is the real enemy here, because it's kind of acting as a quiet crisis all on its own. I think that when we can no longer feel the weight of the world's problems, we also lose the motivation to solve them. And when we lose that motivation, we basically just become spectators to the fires burning all around us. And while I was preparing a bit for this topic and talked about it with some people, I noticed that it's actually a huge pain point for so many of us. We're told about melting ice caps and geopolitical instability, and it all feels so massive and so far beyond our control that our first instinct can be to just shut down. We basically just retreat into our bubbles, not because we don't care about the issues, but because caring feels too heavy to carry. So we basically are just defending ourselves. And I think the problem isn't the lack of information, but rather a lack of connection to the actual problem on an emotional level. Because it's the data that shows us what is happening, but it rarely shows us why we should care on a more human level. And that is exactly where art finds its purpose. You could say that art is the antidote to numbness, or as Louise in a recent interview said,
I think there is something about how art touches us and moves us that is beyond our comprehension. So I think that what has happened to a lot of us is a numbness and a disconnection, and we've become quite disengaged with the reality of what it means to live on this amazing planet. Art is a way to kind of hack that and to make us feel things.
And that is because art speaks a universal language. It bypasses the analytical, overwhelmed part of our brain and plugs directly into our empathy. A single photograph of a lone orangutan in a devastated forest can break our hearts in a way a 200-page report on deforestation never could. And a song can capture a generation's frustration and turn it into a movement. It's about remembering that behind every statistic and every headline, there is a story, and behind every crisis, there is a community of people whose lives are being changed forever by that crisis. And art provides the emotional contact that data alone cannot give to us. And it reignites our ability to feel, and when it does that, it reignites our ability to act and stand up for something we care about. A recent and perfect example of this is Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime show.
God bless America, sea Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Perú, Ecuador, Brasil, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Panamá, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, México, Cuba, República Dominicana, Jamaica, Haití, las Antillas, United States, Canadá, and my motherland, mi patria, Puerto Rico.
On arguably the biggest stage in American entertainment, he became the first Latin artist to headline the show, performing almost entirely in Spanish. Now, this wasn't just a concert, but it was a very strong statement as well. In a social and political climate often gripped by polarization over immigration and identity, he chose not to dilute his message. Instead of translating himself, he transformed the field into a micro Puerto Rico, complete with references to its history, its neighborhoods, and its struggles, like the sparking utility poles that caused the island's chronic blackouts. It was a zero-holdback celebration of Latin culture, which was broadcasted to over 135 million people. Critics and commentators noted that the performance served as a unifying message, challenging the very definition of America by holding up a football that read "Together we are America" at the end.
Seguimos aquí. Ahora sí.
And you could really see that the impact from that performance was huge, because it sparked a global conversation about representation, identity, and what it means to belong to a community. Bad Bunny used his massive platform not just to entertain, but to affirm his culture on his own terms. And he proved that performance can do what countless debates couldn't. It made the world feel the power and pride of a community, hitting the heart first. But let's make one thing very clear. It is not just about consuming art. It's equally much or even more about the radical act of making art. And that counts for all of us. Also, if you're not calling yourself an artist. In her TEDx talk, Amy McNee tells this amazing story about a client who worked in climate science. And this woman felt miserable and incredibly guilty because she was secretly writing what she called trivial romance novels. And she felt like she should be doing something more important to fix the world's problems. McNee challenged that whole idea, arguing that making art is activism.
I had a client that I worked with who was in the science space, and they were working in a climate change sector, and she was miserable. She was really, really struggling, and all she wanted to do was write her romance novels. But she felt so guilty for taking herself away from the climate change space to do something that is so trivial and so frivolous. And again, this is the narrative that we have to break down. We have to understand that art is activism, that it is inherently political to use your voice and to take up space with whatever it is you're making.
In a world that profits from our distraction and a culture of consumption that steals our attention, choosing to create is actually a revolutionary act of rebellion. When you write a poem, paint a canvas, or compose a song, you are reclaiming your focus. And that's because you are then actively pushing back against the passive scrolling of endless bad news or social feeds. The creative act gives you a sense of agency when you feel powerless. And when you create, you are the god of your own small world. You are the one enacting change right there in that moment. And what I really love about this is that this perspective completely reframes the word creativity, because it's not just some hobby you do on the side. It's as vital to our well-being as exercising, eating, meditating, breathing for my part. And creating helps us process the world and channel feelings of despair into something new. And it helps us to build the emotional and mental strength that we all need so much to keep showing up for the hard work. The world doesn't need more activists and scientists, but what it does need is more people who are deeply connected to their own humanity. And making art is one of the best ways to do that. Because in an era that feels increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and digital distance, the human touch in art has never been more important. We are all starting to crave the vulnerability, the mess, the imperfections, that remind us that we're all in this together. And that's because we can use art to feel closer to each other and to bridge our differences. Because we can step into someone else's shoes and views on the world for a moment. It creates a place for us to talk and to reflect and to overcome things together. And that right there is the ultimate power of art in a world on fire. Because it counters the story of despair with one of hope, connection and strength. So then the big question, what do we do with all this? Well, we can start by just recognizing the value of art in our own lives. And that's why I want to ask you, what is a piece of art that recently moved you and made you see the world in a different way? It can be a song, a movie, a book, or maybe something completely else. I'm really curious. So let me know in the comments about that. And also, maybe even more important, what have you felt the urge to create in response to the times we're living in? Just share your thoughts. It doesn't matter if you actually did it already or that you're considering doing it. But I think speaking about it is a way of outing what you're feeling in these times right now. And I think that's what we all need. So let's talk about the art that matters. To finish this all up, when the world is on fire, it's so easy to believe that art is just a luxury or a fun thing to do or see in the weekend. And that it's just decoration or an escape or something that can wait until the real work is done. But that narrative is actively harming us and really unfair towards ourselves. Because I think it's really robbing us of one of our most powerful tools for navigating crises. Art is not an escape from the fire. It's the water that actually will help us to withstand the heat and extinguish that fire. It's the force that cuts through the numbness and reminds us what it feels like to be human, to imagine and then build a better world on the other side. So now that you know that making art is actually an act of generosity and activism, I just want to end with saying the world needs your art. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.